Thank you. Before you have an ordinance that is designed or intended to allow the city to do background checks on certain things that the city licenses. Currently, the ILETS program and the FBI have regulations that allow the city police department to do background checks. And in a review of our licenses with the clerk and the police department and the legal department, it was determined that we would recommend as staff certain background checks for certain licenses that don't currently meet the requirements. And so those include fingerprints required of the peddler, solicitor, canvasser, secondhand dealer, pawnbroker, and vendor licenses. There has been, this was reviewed by the administrative committee, and I have made a change that is included in the draft that broadens the exemption to include any political activity protected by the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, because there's some concern that our current exemption in the peddlers, solicitors, and canvassers was not broad enough to include some things that commonly happen. So other than that, what I have tried to do is make the language consistent with other provisions in our city code where a background check is required, so that there is some continuity between those things, for example, the taxi cab licenses and the daycare licenses, with those that are proposed here.
Thank you, Randy. Does the council have any questions for Randy? Yes, Tom?
But it's my understanding that we don't need to, that people don't need to be licensed to go door to door.
Yeah, that's in the exemptions.
To do anything.
Randy?
Is that right?
That's not correct.
That's not correct.
If
So
you're a peddler or a solicitor and go into the residential neighborhoods, you need to come to the city clerk to get a license to be able to do that.
So could you please define what you mean by a solicitor or a peddler that needs to get a license? Because I'm confused by, maybe I'm just confused by the terminology, but if somebody's coming to my door and wants to sell a religion, is that a solicitor?
The Schwan man.
Or so is it just commercial materials, or is it
Girl Scout cookies?
We have a definition in our code.
Yeah, well, I know we do, but
and it basically is the general idea is that people who are entering the residential neighborhoods for commercial purposes should be regulated to some extent, depending on what it is. So if they solicit sales, take orders, try to sell you different kinds of things, vacuums, Bibles, those different kinds of things, then we do regulate their ability to do so by requiring that they tell us who they are and know what our rules are, that we're able to identify them in case something happens, and occasionally it limits their activities within those residences.
Question for Randy?
I think Randy's looking that up now.
Well, I was just going to try to get the definition, for example, of peddler, solicitor, or canvasser. Any person, either as a principal or agent, who goes from place to place within the city who sells, takes orders for, offers to sell any goods, wares, merchandise, or services, whether collecting in advance for such goods, wares, merchandise, or services or not, or those who seek contributions or donations in goods or legal tender. So that's our definition of...
I'm sorry.
He was asking you to
I was
repeat
just
the
trying to
last
ask
part
you
again.
repeat the
please.
last part.
Or seeks contributions or donations in goods or legal tender. And then, as part of our ordinance, there are different activities that are exempt from that. Would you like me to tell you who,
Yes.
who
Yes.
those are? Okay.
Yes.
Newspaper carriers, whether subscriptions are taken or not. Any person licensed to do such business by the state of Idaho. So if they're licensed by the state of Idaho to do something that we don't regulate them, they're exempt because they've got a state license. Any person under the age of 18 unless employed by another person or organization, they're exempt. Any candidate or representative of a registered political committee, representatives of any charitable or nonprofit organization when the solicitation is managed and conducted solely by officers and members of said organizations who are unpaid for such services, the occasional sale or fundraising efforts by local schools, university student groups, local service clubs and the like, and commercial salespeople soliciting sales and orders from a wholesale business, retail business, local governments, and or schools. Now that's for the peddler, solicitor, and canvasser.
Those are the exempt ones.
Those are exempt under that part of the code. Vendors are handled in a different way, so they're under a different code. But we have exemptions so people can participate in those things that are generally safe, low risk to the people that they're in contact with, and then others who are more transient or more organized as a sales group, then they are regulated through this part of the ordinance.
So just to follow up, what I'm understanding, you mentioned contributions and donations earlier, but then the exemption sounded like that piece might be taken out, provided that they meet these groups of members or whatever of the organization.
Service groups, yeah.
Service
We start by
groups or
trying to...
nonprofit organizations and so forth. Is that?
May I?
Please.
Generally, codes start by trying to define the area that needs to be regulated, and that's usually defined broadly so that you capture those exceptions and kinds of things that you want to address. And then within that, you build exceptions and exemptions so that you're not over-regulating. So that's the nature of almost all ordinances, is you put the net wide and then you let the fish that you don't want to catch, not have to comply with your regulations. In this case, this is a fairly old ordinance, and I haven't gone back to modernize it or rewrite it. The only element that we were focusing on is whether or not we would like to be able to utilize the FBI background criminal check as part of vetting those people or identifying them after the fact.
And what I'm trying to get to is making sure that this excludes the volunteer nonprofit organization that is trying to send volunteers out. I guess my concern is if 20 volunteers for an organization were going to be going out and asking for donations, but now have to get fingerprinted first, it might say, nope, we're not going to do that anymore. They might decide not to do that anymore, and this might be the final nail in the coffin of that organization. So, and I just want to make sure, and it sounds like it's included in the exemptions.
If I may, exemption E under 9.3.12 says, representatives of any charitable or nonprofit organization when the solicitation is managed and conducted solely by officers and members of said organization who are unpaid for such services. So if there was a nonprofit organization that paid a group to go out and solicit for them, they would be under our solicitor's ordinance and not be exempt, and they would need to have a background check. But if the members of the organization themselves, the Kiwanis, the Lions, the Rotarians, religious groups, environmental groups, scouts, those kinds of things go out as members, they can do that, and they're exempt from our ordinance.
Walter?
But paid employees of those organizations would or would not force it into licensing?
Maybe.
Because Boy Scout executives get paid.
Yeah.
Well, I wasn't thinking about them so much. I wasn't thinking about them so much as employees of PCEI, a nonprofit.
Randy?
The problem with asking those kinds of questions is that when you say those organizations, doesn't let me understand what type of organization, what their limitations are. So when those kinds of groups would be considered to be exempt, they can call the clerk, and I would be happy to look at specific facts relative to their activities. So I'm not trying to be coy. That's a really broad question. In general, what I think the the tenor of this code is that if somebody has some commercial purpose, then the ordinance would require them to get registered with a potential background check, unless they were exempt from this ordinance because of the list. So generally speaking, somebody who's a member of an organization can come ask for money at the Audubon Society or the Sierra Club or whomever. But if they're going to go in and sell vacuums and brushes and pots and pans and those kinds of things, it depends on what they do, and that may create an exemption or it may require them to have a background check.
That's what,
Okay, other questions of Randy? Walter?
Employees of PCEI.
I don't know. If they, according to the exemption, if those people are representatives, and they're officers or members of organizations, are unpaid. I will not answer that question because I think it's an unfair question.
It's not intended to be, Randy.
My answer is that if you want that answered, then I can do some research in my office based upon the facts, because I think that to ask about a specific thing, I'm unprepared to do that. Maybe.
This council has an opportunity to consider this on first reading if it so chooses, if we want staff to do some additional research on that.
There's no change suggested in any of the exemptions nor in the definitions, so I'm not trying to avoid that. I'm unprepared to answer that question, and then I think it's inappropriate to ask for a specific legal opinion in public instantaneously unless I have more factual information. So if you'd like, if the mayor would like, or if the administrative committee would like, I would be happy to get direction from you tonight to be able to know how to proceed if what you want to do is change the definitions or revisit the exemptions. But tonight there's no change proposed.
Okay, thank you, Randy. Dan, the administrative committee looked at that.
yes, we did. And like Randy said, most of the changes have to do with, adding in the denial of license parts and the actual fingerprinting for the application. So, we had that pretty much clarified for us. And our big question at that meeting was the political activity, because, honestly, we're coming right into campaign season. What do we go get fingerprinted before you go door to door? And, that I already am, so it doesn't matter. But, with that, I would make a motion that we approve the ordinance under suspension of the rules requiring 3 complete and separate readings, and that be read by title and published by summary.
Second.
Okay, we have Dan's motion and Walter's second. Is there further discussion? Okay. Hearing none, we'll start the roll call vote with Walter.
Aye.
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 Motion carries, and so that's ordinance number 2011-16, an ordinance of the City of Moscow, Idaho, a municipal corporation of the State of Idaho, providing for the amendment of Moscow City Code Title 9, Chapter 4, to require fingerprints of all applicants for a peddler, solicitor, canvasser, secondhand dealer, pawnbroker, or vendor license, providing that the provisions of this ordinance be deemed severable, and providing for this ordinance to be in full force and effect from the date of its passage, approval, and publication according to law.